So our service today is about an emerging dialogue that's happening within Unitarian Universalism between the voices of its tradition as a liberal religion rooted in liberal theology and new voices rooted more in liberation theology. These voices are emerging primarily, although not entirely, from the margins of our religious communities, from the African American or Latino or trans experience within Unitarian Universalism. Liberation theology itself is predicated on hearing the voices of marginalized people. That is why our reflection today was a prayer for quiet, so new voices can be heard. My purpose today is to amplify this ongoing conversation and hopefully clarify it a little and not to weigh in too heavily in favor of one voice or the other, although of course I have my own opinions. But understand this emerging dialogue between within Unitarian Universalism between liberal theology and liberation theology. We have to understand what these traditions are. So I'm going to start today, I'm going to begin with a little review of what these two religious traditions are about, and then we'll move on to how they're talking to each other within Unitarian Universalism. So let's begin with liberal theology or liberal religion. So Unitarian Universalism is a form of liberal religion, and it has always been rooted in liberal theology. Liberal theology is, in essence, an attempt to reconcile religion with the modern world. It grew out of the Enlightenment as a product of the enormous expansion of knowledge that followed the printing press and scientific revolution. It grew out of the democratic revolutions that leveled societies, removed aristocracies from power, and gave the common person the crazy idea that they ought to have some agency in the running of their own lives and shaping their own societies. It grew out of the global human rights revolution that said that every person should have basic rights like freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. These enormous social and cultural changes changed the worldview and the basic expectations of the average Western person. Liberal theology, as it developed in the 18th and 19th century in the West, and it is for the most part a Western phenomenon, was the accommodation of religion to the sensibility of the modern person. It has evolved to be the kind of religion that a thoroughly modern person could believe without having this inner tension between their religious beliefs and their modern identity and their modern sense of understanding. So, for example, liberal religion is skeptical. It values reason and science over tradition and revelation. One of the big dust-ups in early Unitarianism, actually, came over the question of miracles, the miracle stories in the Bible. And I remind you, Unitarianism grew out of Christianity. So some Unitarians were arguing that you simply have to believe the miracle stories in the Bible because that is what establishes the moral authority of Jesus. That's what says that he is special. Other Unitarians, like Theodore Parker, argued that no one could believe the miracle stories in the Bible, and it was morality that established the moral authority of Jesus. The teachings of Jesus, he argued, are true because they're true, not because Jesus said them. It doesn't matter who said them. This was a hugely upsetting idea to many early Unitarians. We're talking like the 1830s, and they fought about it for a long time, and then they got over it, and here we are. And as liberal theology progressed, it tended to carve out a wider and wider sphere for the individual to exercise their own reason and judgment in religion. The Unitarians in particular, we know, abhorred creeds of any kind, any statement of required belief in religion. Liberal religion is committed to the free mind. Now, not every religion went so far as Unitarian Universalism, right? We are radical in our promotion of theological openness and our embrace of theological diversity. But mainline Christians too, for example, other Protestants, certainly read the Bible critically and not literally. And they have done that for centuries, right? Fundamentalism and biblical literalism actually arose in like the 1920s as a response to liberal Christianity. It's kind of a new thing. So liberal religion had lots of room for different ideas about who Jesus was. It may not believe in a literal heaven and hell. It doesn't think God cares who wins football games. if a teaching of religion contradicts science, liberal religion will throw out the religious belief first. Liberal theology is democratic. It is broadly tolerant of people's individual life choices. It tends to be suspicious of tradition, rules, hierarchies, authority, ministers, crowds. As such, it tends to be corrosive of arbitrary social structures and traditions. On the other hand, it is optimistic about human nature and believes humans to be basically good. It is reformist in temperament. It likes to reform things. It is not revolutionary. When people behave badly, as they sometimes do, liberal religion is likely to say, well, there's bad ideas going on here. There's bad environment here. They don't blame it on human evil or total depravity like the Calvinists would do. They say we need some education. We need to reform some institutions. We need nurturance. So Unitarians were pioneers in bringing free, universal, secular education to this country. They have been involved in virtually every social reform movement this country has ever known because they seek to reform things as their way of dealing with problems. They want to eliminate problems like war and world hunger through better global institutions. They're great institution planters. The social gospel movement of the late 19th and early 20th century saw this kind of reform widely spread across liberal Christianity. Everyone was getting in on that, not just us. And finally, liberal religion tends to be humanist. And by this I mean two things. It is worldly in its orientation. Whatever its teachings about the next world or the afterlife, it sees religion as a vehicle for promoting individual human happiness. Healthy families, harmonious communities, a peaceful world right here in this life. And it expects these good things to come primarily through human effort. Religion inspires us, it instructs us, but then it is up to us to do the actual work to make its vision a reality. God, if we believe in God, may operate within our hearts, but it is up to us to then act with our minds and our bodies, right? So liberal religion doesn't expect miracles. It doesn't expect divine intervention. It is not apocalyptic. It is not waiting for this world to be consumed by fire and then remade in a better image, right? So that is liberal theology. Primarily Western, individualistic, rational, democratic, scientific, humanist, and fundamentally concerned with human happiness. And protective of individual rights and freedoms. Okay? That is Unitarian Universalism to a great degree. We are highly, highly in the liberal religion mode. So liberation theology, developed in the late 20th century, out of an entirely different set of concerns. It has arisen primarily in the global South, but we also see it in marginalized communities in the West. It comes out of Christianity. It is primarily Bible-based and God-centered, although it doesn't have to be. It does not share liberal religion's preoccupation with the individual, although it is deeply concerned with human worth and dignity. It is protective of tradition and local culture, which it sees as bearing a people's worth and a dignity, their sense of pride. It is suspicious of modernity, especially of the tendency of global capitalism to kind of steamroll everything in its path as it Disneyfies the whole world. It is revolutionary. It is not reformist. It seeks a fundamental redistribution of wealth and power. At its core, liberation theology is a religious response to the existence of oppressed peoples around the world, particularly of the global poor. Scholar and liberation theologian Hinson-Rieger, no relation, notes that in the 70s and 80s, multiple liberation theologies developed simultaneously around the world, in Latin America, in African American communities in America, in feminist communities. They all focused on different forms of oppression, but they were all in conversation with each other. And Rieger notes that these theologies were not written as the accomplishments of individual scholars, but they were in close encounter with severe suffering and pressure in many shapes and forms. So liberation theology comes out of the direct experience of suffering and the engagement with suffering people. It comes out of oppression. And the fundamental principle of liberation theology, expressed in theistic language, is that God is a God of the oppressed. God takes sides in human society and in human history, and God is on the side of the poor. If you want to know who God is rooting for, God is rooting for the poor. And its corollary is that God is opposed to systems of oppression. If you are doing something that is keeping people in poverty, God has an opinion about that, and it is that you are doing something wrong. And social systems that are rooted in racism or patriarchy are by definition sinful, and God wants them to not exist anymore. What God wants is the liberation of poor people from systems that oppress them. What God wants you to do is liberate poor people from systems that oppress them. And we see God working in the world precisely when people like you free oppressed people from their oppressions. Modern-day liberation theologian William Barber III likes to point out that the Bible contains literally thousands of scriptures dealing with the way we are supposed to treat the poor. It is a fundamental concern of the text, right? So theologian James Cone wrote in A Black Theology of Liberation, Christianity is essentially a religion of liberation. Any message that is not related to the liberation of the poor in society, he says, is not Christ's message. And his corollary in the American context, where poverty and oppression and racism are inextricably bound up together, was that any American church that was not working to undo racism, that was not working to free black people, that was not concerned with the oppressed, did not deserve to be called a church at all. It has so fundamentally missed the point of Christianity and of religion that it might as well not even call itself a church. Because freeing people from oppression, what we might today call social justice, is not a side concern of the church in this view. It is the concern of the church. It is its reason for being. And in the theistic or the Christian context, it is how we experience God in the world, through participating in acts of liberation and in being liberated ourselves. However, liberation theology is not limited to Christianity. It's not limited even to theistic religion. It does not have to be God or Bible-based. So theologian Miguel de la Torre, he lays out the following principles of liberation theology in his book, which is called The Hope of Liberation in World Religions. He's wanting to show how liberation theology can exist in all these different traditions. So he lays out its basic principles. And you can see how many of these principles do or could resonate within Unitarian Universalism. First, liberation theology is fundamentally about restoring human worth and dignity to the oppressed. Rather than convince the non-believer to believe, writes Gustavo Gutierrez in A Theology of Liberation, the founding text, the liberationist goal is to convince the non-person of their personhood. The liberationist goal is to convince the non-person of their personhood so that they are recognized as having worth and dignity. And I hope that sounds familiar to you, because our first UU principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity of each person, right? So our religion calls us to resist forces that dehumanize in any form. The tendency of liberal religion, however, and of our own history, is to do this by rescuing people from a position of superiority. As people with knowledge and power and social capital, we will come in and rescue you. And liberation theology insists that we can only liberate from a place of solidarity, not from rescuing and saving, but working side by side and sharing experiences. Rescuing or saving people, it would say, is fundamentally dehumanizing. It is inherently dehumanizing. So it cannot be liberation. Liberation theology believes that theology emerges from the grassroots. People's beliefs are contextual and reflect their lived experiences. And so we should expect theological diversity. And here again, Unitarian Universalism also expects theological diversity. As a form of liberal religion, though, it understands theology as a set of beliefs held by an individual, right? It sees theological diversity in person to person to person to person. Liberation theology understands theology as a way of life practiced by communities. So it tends to focus on communal life. The focus is a little different. Since diversity is expected, liberation theology emphasizes correct action rather than correct doctrine. Liberation theology is interested in practices that free people from their oppression, not in whether you believe this or that right thing. Right? In other words, it is interested in deeds, not creeds. And again, that should sound familiar to Unitarian Universalists. And finally, liberation theology always asks the question, how does God, using that theistic language, relate not only to the dominant history, the one that gets written in all the history books, but also to the histories of the excluded, of the marginalized? So liberation theology seeks to uncover even the just basic reality of global poverty and global suffering and make it urgent to people. It seeks to bring the voices of the unheard and the excluded into the dominant narrative. And it insists that how you treat the least of these tells you all you need to know about what your religion is about. So in this vein, in A Black Theology of Liberation, James Cone aims some pointed criticisms at the history of liberal religion. He points out that while liberal religion in the late 19th century was basking in this sunny optimism about the goodness of human nature and forecasting progress, and more progress, the upward rising of humanity forever, there was a literal genocide going on against Native people at the exact same time. And black people all around them were being systematically terrorized and dispossessed and oppressed right in their society. So whose progress, he asks, exactly were you celebrating? And who did you think your religion was for? So this is a critique of white supremacy in our tradition that is familiar to us by now. But for Cone and others, moreover, liberal religion's great temptation and our great distraction, he would say, is to be overly focused on protecting individual freedoms and catering to individual needs and meeting the needs of already privileged people rather than risking those freedoms and comforts to join in solidarity with the oppressed. And so the lack of solidarity made the liberal religion basically irrelevant in James Cone's eyes to the Liberation Project. So today, however, at least within Unitarian Universalism, liberal religion is beginning to dialogue much more with liberation theology. This past January, there was a public dialogue at First Unitarian Portland, big church on the West Coast, between the Reverend Sophia Betancourt and Reverend Bill Sinkford, both former presidents of the Unitarian Universalist Association. It was called From Liberal to Liberation. And Reverend Betancourt said she wants liberalism to kind of lean into liberation. You don't have to go all the way over there, but just like lean into it. And she recognizes the fundamental importance of individual freedom to Unitarian Universalism, but she asks, can we complicate our understanding of freedom a little bit by seeking to be in solidarity with those who are experiencing the most suffering in the world, suffering on a level that is beyond our experience? See, she suggests we can't even really understand what it will mean to be free when so many are unfree. So in working towards collective liberation, she asks us to allow new voices to emerge to be heard and to give those voices space to lead. And this is part of a fundamental principle of liberation theology that oppressed people already know for themselves what they need to be free. They don't need other people to tell them. They don't need relatively privileged people to tell them what they need. So part of getting us all free together, which is the goal, is empowering people who have not formerly been in power and giving them the ability to lead. And we have seen a big push for this in our denomination in the last decade, and I can tell you it is beginning to change some things. Whose Faith Is It Anyway?, a symposium on black UU theology, echoed that call for new voices. The question was raised, what would Unitarian Universalism look like if it drew from the texts of black lives or brown lives? How would its concerns and practices look different? And this is a question, again, rooted in liberation theology, which is focused on context and lived experience and practice. So to this question, we could also ask, what would UU look like if it shaped its theology and its practices from the texts of trans lives or disabled lives or lives lived on the economic margins? Of course, it does draw on these voices, but it does so hesitatingly, partially, fitfully, incompletely. So we are beginning to recognize that within our religion, there are not just differences of belief between individuals, which we are used to. There are different communities of belief and different communities of practice. And that is something that we are less familiar with when there are entire communities within our tradition that see things a little differently than the majority and want to do things a little differently than the majority, right? And making space for that is trickier, but it will also be richly rewarding because it expands our understanding of what UU can be. And it invites us into more genuine relationship, and it invites us into solidarity because it is a walking with someone, even if their ways are different than what we're expecting. And finally, Anthony Pinn, who's an African-American UU humanist, places liberation theology in the context of a naturalistic, a non-theistic humanism that he clearly sees as compatible with Unitarian Universalism because he is a Unitarian Universalist. Liberation, he writes, is concerned with a fullness of existence, the removal of oppressive socioeconomic, political, and cultural structures. Its concern for community must evolve attention to the interrelatedness of all life, to the synergies of existence that balance life as complex and multi-layered. He says, naturalistic humanism encourages a view of the world that takes in the web-like nature of oppression and seeks to promote healing and balance for all forms of life. So we hear echoes in this language, and not by accident, I don't think, of our seventh UU principle, respect for the interdependent web of existence of which we are all a part. This principle originated out of engagement with ecological thinkers and feminists and pagan and earth-based traditions, but it has come to ground and shape our religious tradition in a profound way. Our seventh principle is our deepest and most far-reaching religious principle, literally, because the word religion comes from religio, meaning to bind, and our seventh principle binds us to all living things. It is a recognition of our connection with all beings and with the energies of creation itself, right? So it is a recognition of our interdependence. And this emphasis on interdependence is a vehicle by which Unitarian Universalism begins to shift from being just about individualism to being more about solidarity. And then we're leaning into that liberation. As a liberal theology, we are still concerned with freedom. But what does freedom mean in the context of this deep interrelatedness? If it is true that I cannot be free until you are free, then our very concern for freedom leads us to concern for community, leads us to solidarity for all of those who are unfree. It leads us into liberation. So today after the service, there are two different sets of workshops. One of them focuses on practical information on how to lead more environmentally sustainable, earth-friendly lives. UUI has a strong commitment to doing environmental work, here and in the community. And in the face of the global climate crisis, I would say the earth itself is in need of liberation. And so in this respect, I think Unitarian Universalism has something to say back to liberation theology, because our seventh principle invites us to consider liberation on a scale beyond just human community to the earth itself. The second set of workshops, which is in response to a recent UU World article, looks at what happens when marginalized voices, in this case transgender and non-binary voices, are not brought into a conversation where they should have been, and the harm that is done when we attempt to serve a community without being in solidarity with it. That serving, saving approach. It is, in a sense, a study in why the liberation approach can be important and what happens when it was left out. So I hope you will stay for lunch and join us for one or the other workshop. Our tradition of liberal religion is one of which we should be justly proud. It is a many centuries long legacy of freeing the mind, of lifting the human spirit, of breaking down social barriers and protecting the individual. Within this proud tradition, new voices are emerging that ask us to consider what would it mean to risk bigger in our religious commitments, to understand freedom and individualism in new ways, to allow new people to lead, and to journey alongside of one another from a place of solidarity. So in having this conversation, may we listen to one another with generous hearts, with minds open to new possibilities, and with hands ready to take up new and exciting work. Blessed be, and amen.